and we'll create a commission.
Okay, let's go. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. And on behalf of Cambridge University Press, I thank you all for joining us this evening. We all know that it is very difficult to make time in busy schedules, and it honors and humbles us that despite that fact, we have this elite gathering here today with us. Cambridge University Press is part of the University of Cambridge, and in 2012, India became the third publishing center of the press. Since then, we have been publishing very extensively in science and social sciences, and the rich content of our publication is intended to stimulate lively debate at the frontier of the scholarship. We are excited to be here today to release this very interesting and timely book, Democratic Dynasties. This book is an expert look at dynastic politics in contemporary India and provide new perspectives where dynasties came from and why they matter. It goes beyond the Nehru-Gandhi family and looks at lesser-known dynasties that have emerged as key players in Indian politics. The editor Kanchan Chandra is professor of politics at New York University, and she is also a chair of the program on South Asia at New York University. Her previous books include Constructivist Theories of Ethnic Politics and Ethnic Parties Succeed, Why Ethnic Parties Succeed. And she is also a prominent commentator on Indian politics. With the launch of this book, we are aiming to bring together outstanding scholars and public figures. So please join us in welcoming the panel, Neerja Gopal Jayal, Salman Khurshid, Jayan Sinha, Kanchan Chandra, and Patrick French, who will also be moderating the discussion. May I now request Mr. Ratnesh Jha, our MD, CUP South Asia, to join the honorary panel and unveil the book. You have the book. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would now request Kanchan to take the stage and open the discussion this evening.
So I want to thank Cambridge University Press, first of all, for backing this book for the entire process from the time of as a typewritten manuscript to the production and marketing and then organizing this event. They did a really terrific job. I'd also like to thank the co-hosts, Lokniti, CSDS. They really have transformed the study of Indian elections by focusing on the data-driven study of Indian democracy and how we understand it. And so I'm very proud that they are co-hosts of this event. And then finally, a big thank you to Seminar Magazine. Seminar published an early version, an issue on dynastic politics in 2011. And I think the space they created for that discussion and then their support in today's event has really transformed the reach of the ideas in this book as well. So thank you very much to all three of those organizations. I'm just going to say very little about, because all of the panelists are so well known, I'll just say a little bit about the idea behind the panel and the reason to invite this particular set of panelists, and then talk briefly about the book and then leave it to Patrick to moderate the discussion. Patrick French, who will be moderating the panel, many of you know him already. He has a long relationship with South Asia. He did a book on Tibet. He wrote a biography of Naipaul, which is when I first encountered his work. And his book, India, A Portrait, published in 2011, had a chapter on dynastic politics, which really provoked the discussion. In a way, this book tries to pick up where Patrick left off. And the important thing he did in that chapter is to try and move the study of dynastic politics from history and biography and memoir to a study of patterns based on the data. And so it's terrific that he is moderating the panel today. Salman Khurshid is the former Minister of External Affairs in the Congress Party. He is also a former Minister of Law and Justice. He has degrees from St. Stephen's and Oxford, and he is also from a political family. His father, Khurshid Alam Khan, was also a former Minister of External Affairs. His grandfather, Dr. Zakir Hussain, was the third President of India, and he is also a prolific writer. His most recent book, published in 2014, was titled The Saga of Indian Muslims. Mr. Jayant Sinha, again, the Minister of State for Civil Aviation, formerly the Minister of State for Finance from the BJP. Lok Sabha MP from Hazaribagh, where he succeeded his father, Yashwant Sinha, also a former finance minister. He has degrees from IIT, from Penn, from Harvard, but I particularly was very happy to have him speak on the panel because he has spoken many times and very thoughtfully about dynastic politics on the campaign trail in interviews and statements that I've read. And I think certainly many of his views are different from some of the views presented in the book, and I think it's important to have that kind of a juxtaposition in this discussion. Anisha Gopal Jayal, who is a professor, Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU. She is one of India's most distinguished social scientists, with a deep and rich body of work on democracy and representation. And I think of Nirja's work as quite unique, or one of a handful of social scientists who is able to combine political philosophy with a real attention to data and empirics. And so it's wonderful that she's able to do this. Her most recent book, called Citizenship and Its Discontents, published by Harvard University Press, has received a great deal of national and international attention. And so I can't think of anyone better to link some of the data-based content of this book with the broader narrative of representation and democracy in India. So that's so much for the introduction. I'll hand it over to Patrick to tell us how to proceed.
Thank you so much, Kanchan. So just to welcome you again on behalf of CSDS and CUP and Seminar Magazine, and of course the beautiful Bikaner House where we're being hosted this evening. The format will be that Kanchan Chandra will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, telling you the theme behind democratic dynasties, the kind of gist of the book. And then each of the other panelists will speak very briefly for just 5 minutes. And then by the time we get to around about 7:30, we'll have a general discussion. I will ask questions and you can ask questions too. So if I could ask Kanchan for you first to speak, please. I think I'll turn off my microphone because there seems to be a bit of a feedback loop going.
Thank you. And please, if you could stop me if I take too long, because I might need that. I'll just say one thing on moderation. This book is in English, this discussion is in English, but clearly this is not a subject that concerns people who only speak English. You know, there may be many people here, and you know, we'll do some discussions in other languages and other places outside Delhi. But today, at least in Delhi, आप में से कई लोग होंगे जो हिंदी में सवाल करना चाहेंगे. आप ज़रूर कीजिएगा, उसका moderation मैं कर लूँगी. But at least we should keep it open to those two languages, at least at this event. So let me tell you a little bit about the book and how it originated. The idea for the book came in 2009 when I was actually in India working on a book on a completely different subject. But that was the year there was so many MPs in the Indian Parliament with a family background. That was something that was quite impossible to ignore. And one of the surprising things in that year, it has changed now, is that there was practically no real study of dynastic politics in modern day democracies. I'm a political scientist. In my discipline, democracy is probably the best studied problem that you could imagine. But because dynastic politics is typically seen as an antithesis of democracy, it just hadn't emerged as a serious object of study. In anthropology, which is the traditional discipline to work on kin relations, you know, typical studies in anthropology worked on kinship-based societies, you know, sort of small societies, but no one had really addressed this question of dynastic politics in modern day democracies. And yet we know that this is an entrenched and pervasive phenomenon. India is not unique. So one of the things the book does is try and place India in a kind of comparative context. In India, on average, in the 21st century, about a quarter of Indian MPs, about 25%, have been dynastic in the last three parliaments, 2004, 2009, 2014. That places us in the middle of the spectrum. You know, for the countries for which we have data, the Philippines is at one end with about 50% of its legislators drawn from dynastic backgrounds. Canada in 2011 was at the lower end with about 3%. India, Japan sits squarely in the middle. You know? So this is now something that has only begun to be studied. For me, this was the reason to actually do it, because it seemed it's so fundamentally important to democracies as we understand them. And yet, simply by virtue of assuming that dynasty is somehow a violation of democratic principles, it just had not become an object of study. And so I started collecting data then on dynastic politics in India with a dedicated group of research assistants at NYU. And over time, the project became collaborative. And now in the book, what we have is Simon Chauchard and Anjali Bolkan collaborated with me on collecting the data. And then we had a number of collaborators use the data to address different aspects of dynastic politics in India. And I do want to remember at this point Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, who wrote a really terrific chapter in the book on India's first elections in 1951 and why the royal families were not able to actually win the electoral game. The Rudolphs passed away just when this book was in final stages of production, and so we dedicated the book to them. So now the two questions the book addresses is, what are the reasons you have dynastic ties in the Indian parliament, and what are the consequences dynastic politics has for democracy in India? And I'll start with just saying a little bit about the title of the book, Democratic Dynasties, and what we mean by that. We define a dynastic MP as an MP who simply has a family member who preceded him or her in electoral politics. So it could be, it need not be that your preceding family member was an MP or was the chief minister. As long as you had a prior family member in electoral politics, we would code you as a dynastic MP. So one of the interesting things we found is most dynasties in the Indian context, and this goes actually outside parliament, are a very recent democratic vintage, typically created after 1960. So there are very few, royal families are only about 3% of the Indian parliament on average, 2004, 9, and 14. And former royal families are only about 10% of India's dynastic class. And so really what you have in this case are dynasties that have sprung up through the democratic process, and that's one reason why we label this phenomenon as democratic dynasties. And here, again, the data are just being collected now since 2009. This has become an emerging body of work in my discipline. And we do now have some data that let us compare. But if you take Pakistan, for instance, there is a much greater space in Pakistani politics, or at least the politics of Punjab, for a former landed elite that essentially persisted or reinvented itself through democracy. But India here is distinct in the relative newness of its dynastic families. What we try and do in the book is say, well, where does this prevalence of dynastic politics come from, given that it's not unique? And there's one very common explanation, which I'm sure some of you have thought of, you read it in the papers every day, that it is something cultural, that we Indians have, value family ties. Maybe there's the idea of a caste system, or this acceptance of the notion that family and occupation go together. That is one of the arguments we argue against in the book. We don't think that dynastic politics in the Indian context is a product of some cultural preference for dynasties. In fact, the majority of voters, there's been one survey on this, one nationwide survey on this, done by Milan Vaishnav and his colleagues Neelanjan Sarkar and Devesh Kapoor. And in that survey, it showed that 46% of Indian voters prefer dynasties in one particular election, which still leaves us with the majority who don't. But even when we look at constituencies, there's a lot of switching. There are very few, there are only about 5% of India's constituencies which have been continuously represented by a dynastic MP between 2004 and 2014. In most cases, there is a 90%, there is a whole lot of switching, and it is very common for a dynastic MP or a dynastic candidate to be defeated by a non-dynastic one. So we don't think that this is so it doesn't seem, if you look at the data, that there is any clear cultural preference for dynastic politics. 2 minutes, I think I can manage that. But also, given how widespread dynastic politics is, it's clear that India is not unique. So the central argument the book makes is that if we think about why dynastic politics has arisen, it is a product of political parties, and in particular, it is a product of a ticket allocation process, which is very informal, it's centralized, with no clear criteria for candidate selection. And that process of ticket allocation ends up producing a consistent favoritism towards dynastic candidates across political parties. One point we make in the book is dynastic politics in India, and certainly dynastic MPs, it's not just a Congress phenomenon, it's pervasive across parties. There is a difference in degree. The Congress party currently in the current parliament, about 48% of Congress MPs are dynastic. The BJP is significantly less so, 15%. So there's a difference in degree, but you have this pervasiveness also across the smaller parties. We think it's because of this favoritism within the ticket allocation process. And why would parties actually favor dynastic candidates? Even, interestingly enough, parties whose ideologies or whose leadership actually lead them to oppose dynastic politics. And we argue in the book that it's a question of loyalty, that in a situation where political parties are organizationally weak, you are deeply concerned about the cohesiveness about your local level units, you're concerned about local level defections, and the use of family ties as a principle for ticket allocation allows you to circumvent those concerns for loyalty. And so you have now what is really what we think of as a dynastic imperative in Indian politics, where even political parties or political leaders that have remained quite stubbornly resistant to dynastic politics end up succumbing at one point or another. And I think the classic example of this is Mamata Banerjee, the Chief Minister of West Bengal, who built a brand on the basis of being a non-dynastic leader, but who now has, her nephew is now quite active in the party, her brothers participate in her political campaigns. And I think the key thing we want to highlight is that this is not unique, or also that this is not in some ways irrational or born of a lust for power. There is this very rational imperative that is pushing parties towards dynastic politics. I'll take half a minute to talk about the consequences and then stop. But when it comes to the consequences, again, there is the deck is stacked. I think in this argument, the dynastic politics are somehow a violation of democracy. They create a politics of exclusion. And we do find that it does that. So we do, and here there's also, the book is also backed by a lot of statistical work that is not in the book because I wanted the book to be accessible to a broader readership. But we do find, for instance, if you include any measure of qualification or performance, performance in parliament, constituency level service, political experience, a lot of this is in the book as well. You cannot link party favoritism for dynastic politics to these qualifications, on average. I mean, I think you may have individual exceptions. And so you really have a case where the accident of birth has become a qualification in itself. And that is one form of violation, and it does create a politics of exclusion. One of the ways in which it creates a politics of exclusion is you already have an overrepresentation of Hindu upper caste in the Indian parliament. 43% of the current Indian parliament is dynastic. But when you look at the dynastic class, it amplifies that dominance. So Hindu upper caste, I should say Hindu upper caste, are about 53% of India's dynastic class in the 2014 parliament. So there is clearly, I think, a kind of violation, a sort of an amplification of exclusion. But, and this is the final point, this is the twist. There is also ways in which dynastic politics furthers inclusion in Indian democracy, particularly for subaltern groups who do not have quotas. So when we think about Muslims, for example, or women, or backward castes, and also, I wouldn't call this a subaltern group, but young people. But when you have a situation where the political system is closed in these ways to these groups, dynastic politics ends up becoming a channel through which a system that is relatively closed allows a channel for entry of these new groups. And so this is the last sentence. In a system where you have, where there are barriers to entry for these new groups, for these subordinate groups anyway, not having dynastic politics itself becomes a form of inequity. And so you have this sort of paradoxical relationship with both exclusion and inclusion at the same time. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Professor Kanchan Chandra. And we'll now hand over to Mr. Salman Khurshid.
Thank you, Patrika. 5 minutes to talk about something that's gone on for centuries. Frankly, as far as I see this book, the interesting thing, of course, is statistics that we know from our experience of being in public life and politics, that this is something which is common. But a point that I guess gets missed when you're looking only at democratic dynasties in public life, which is in politics, is perhaps a missing chapter that could have compared what is happening in other sections of our society, what is happening in law, for instance, what is happening in media, what's happening in Bollywood, what's happening in many other fields, that there is a direct connection of the present generation of successful people with their predecessors being from their own families. Whether you're a TV channel anchors, or you're successful lawyers, or you're judges. Right now, I mean, if you look at judges right now in the Supreme Court, you would find that many of them are progeny of judges. And there's obviously a larger explanation of how this happens and why this happens. Even in industry, I think that the control of industry and business in our country is vastly different from the manner in which it's controlled and run and organized in Europe or in the United States of America. Family-controlled families, not just family-owned businesses, but family-controlled businesses is what you get to see. The field of culture, Mala is sitting here, I've got to mention her. These are strong traditional families that are associated with culture in our country. Writers, anything, look at anything and you would find that there is hand down from generation to generation. Why does that happen? I believe, and I can't validate that thesis immediately, but I believe that we never had a real revolution in our country as China had. So what we did is that we morphed Indian feudalism into modern democracy. So it's not just simple democracy that we have, but we have feudalism morphed into democracy. So very clear signals and signs of feudalism that you see everywhere. And that, of course, is further strengthened by the fact that we haven't really relieved ourselves of the stranglehold of the caste system, which now has introduced beyond caste religions, etc. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, my interest from the ground and from the field is that dynasties are forced upon us. We are so accustomed as political workers. There are no part-time political workers in India. In the United States of America, people come out for a year and a half, elect a president, get back and do their jobs. And the next time there's a president's election, a very small number of those supporters come back to be active workers for the presidential campaign. In India, 30 years after you've seen a guy for the first time in an election, he's still there when elections are announced, and he turns up very faithfully and very diligently to do the work that he did 30 years ago. And for him, if you disappear and your family disappears or your children disappear, he doesn't know where to go. So if he's loyal to the family, he's also loyal to the party, he's also loyal to a setup which is really part of the modern democratic feudalism. And I think that's where it begins. It begins with the need and the determination and the desire of the worker to ensure that he has somebody who symbolizes the presence of the family, the person, the visage, the personality that he associated himself with, and he can't think of moving out. So essentially a serious question of social mobility. Of course, changes are now taking place, new people are emerging, new political parties are emerging, and so you see new faces of people who have not been in public life, but how quickly those parties also assimilate people from older parties who've been part of the dynastic culture is there writ large for anyone to see. So the answer really is bottom up. The political dynasties and democratic dynasties happen because the ground level person hasn't broken away from feudalism. That's my impression.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khurshid. And I'll now turn to Mr. Jayant Sinha.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and wonderful to see you all here. Clearly, this is a topic of great interest, which is why we have a standing room only crowd. And I think this discussion comes at a very opportune time as well, because this is a moment when I think Indian democracy has shown what it can accomplish by the passing of the GST in the Rajya Sabha in a unanimous way. So I think we are seeing Indian democracy in some ways, a wonderful debate in the Rajya Sabha at its finest hour. And so if we are therefore talking about Indian democracy and are talking about dynasties, the part that I think we have to be very anchored in, and I think my position will be somewhat different from what Shri Khurshid Sahab has said, is I think that हमारे देश में जनता जनार्दन है, तो जो जन आदेश आता है, जो जनता चाहती है वही होता है. it is a great democracy. It is a democracy, as you've shown through the numbers, that is able to churn through dynastic factors, competence, ideology. It's able to process all of that. And through that great churning, select candidates. And we, of course, as the whole world acknowledges, run the most extraordinary elections that anywhere has been witnessed, which of course is happening here. So there is a vast churning, and therefore in this vast churning where all these factors are processed, the people decide. And I think in my own experience, again speaking from the ground level, just like Khurshid Saab is speaking from the ground level, is that we move well past the feudalism that he speaks of. And in that sense, I think people make very rational decisions in terms of whom they select as their winning candidates. And because people are making rational decisions as they're churning through all these factors, it's parties that are then responding in kind. Parties are selecting candidates, and really my own experience, limited as it has been that parties select those candidates that we think are most likely to win. And if the process of selection itself is meritocratic, if the process of selection is open and fair, then the allocation of tickets takes that into account and selects those candidates that are most likely to win. And they are most likely to win because ultimately they're able to serve the electorate in the best possible way. And I think that really is the great churning of the democratic process in India. Now, I'll conclude by saying that there is in fact a vast difference between dynasty, and I've tried to do that in some of my writings and interviews in the past as well. There's a vast difference between dynasty and legacy. And the difference is that, somebody who comes into public life following sort of a dynastic succession is typically much younger, less experienced, has not necessarily led a professional life where they have proven themselves, they've demonstrated that they can get things done, that they have the ability to be capable of executing difficult tasks and under great pressure and so on in another career. And the people who come into public life because there's a legacy, where there is a legacy, as in Khurshid Saab's case, of a family for many generations serving the country. And you can serve the country in many ways. You can serve it through electoral politics. In the case of my family, of course, my father's been in electoral politics, but generations of my family have been in service of this country through the IAS, through the ICS, and various other ways in which they've served the country. So if you are born into a family with those values and that legacy of service to the nation, then it is a choice you confront as an individual as well, which is, will you embrace that legacy or not? And each of us can embrace the legacy in different ways. My brother, for instance, runs a very successful company. He's creating jobs, he's providing renewable energy to India. I think that's a very noble thing to do. And that's what he's done. That's a great way of taking forward the legacy and serving the nation. I'm doing it in my own small way, in a different way as well. But I think all of us who have a legacy of service do have to confront these choices and decide how they themselves are going to take that legacy of service to the nation forward. And that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. And if we can now go to Professor Jayal.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm sorry, going to pull you back to the academic register. I'm going to offer 3 reasons why I think everyone should read this book, and then raise a couple of questions that the book, I think, provokes us to think about and probe further. There's so little scholarly literature on dynastic politics anywhere, and this is the first full-length book treatment of this phenomenon, and a very rigorous treatment at that. So here are my 3 reasons why you should read this book. The first is that it complicates and even unsettles our standard normative assumptions about dynasty and its anti-democratic quality. Kanchan mentioned this in passing, but let me say a little more about it. Our normative instinct is to see dynasty as inimical to or antithetical to democracy, and this book offers a provocation to that assumption. It marshals an enormous amount of data and suggests that the interactions between democracy and dynasty are actually more complex. And then it goes on to argue that paradoxically enough, dynasty can provide avenues of representation to groups which otherwise might not have got representation, and it can actually further the inclusion of disadvantaged groups. In other words, it identifies what I might call some of the collateral political benefits of dynasty. Amrita Basu's paper is the strongest argument, or makes a very strong case here, perhaps too strong, that dynastic politics has brought women into legislatures in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. And similarly, young people. The book tells us, and this is a fascinating fact, that the 16th Lok Sabha is India's oldest parliament, but that its younger MPs are disproportionately dynastic. The reason? It is much easier to persuade aging, upper caste patriarchs to step down to make way for their own progeny than to make way for promoting promising young talent, which happens not to be related to them in terms of kinship. But other than women and the young, I think the claim of the inclusive effect of dynasticism that Kanchan makes in a sort of moderate way, and Simon Shorshard rather more strongly, I think, is much weaker, I believe, for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and Muslims. And as Anjali Bolkan writes, your colleague, not all dynasts are created equal. Second reason, the book provides us with an incredibly rich range of data on dynasties in India. It covers, and I'll just sort of bullet point these, degrees of dynasticism in the last 3 Lok Sabhas, how successful dynasts are in elections, their margins of victory, their likelihood of getting renominated, their likelihood of getting re-elected, and variations across these 3 elections in terms of age, gender, social and religious background, all regions, all political parties. So in terms of data, this is a veritable feast. Finally, and most importantly, the book essays an interesting explanation for dynasties in Indian democracy, and Kanchan only mentioned half of it, so I'm going to mention both bits. The argument actually has 2 parts. The enormous returns, she says, associated with state office and the weak organization of political parties on which she dwelt. Together, they constitute, to my mind, a convincing explanation for the larger picture, even if some exceptions remain. And it's the exceptions which may be statistically insignificant, but it's obvious that they are intriguing because many of them occupy significant leadership positions. They can't be explained in terms of those 2, at least not the first factor. So of course it is the case that the old regime dynasties about which the Rudolphs have written so charmingly in this book have given way to a new type of political aristocracy, which is the creation of our democracy. But one wonders if some of the post-feudal political dynasties that we have, and Mr. Khurshid, of course, is referring to them all as democratic feudals, but let's say they're most feudals, they need an explanation that is not centered, I think, on the seductions of discretionary state power and the material returns attached to that, not power and pelf, so to speak, but because of the enormous social and cultural capital they already possess, these individuals. So might it be the attraction of some symbolic aspects of state power? You've dealt with the material. But, fame, glory, ideals of public service, I know we are cynical about these ideals, but is this a phenomenon that somehow bears some similarity to perhaps political families in other countries like the United States, right? So this takes me, Patrick, do I have a minute? To 2 questions at least. I have a bunch of questions, but those I will ask Kanchan later. 2 questions that I think this book provokes. The first is about the possible relationship between dynasty and plutocracy. We have been told that the 16th Lok Sabha is the richest Lok Sabha ever, and the wealthiest MP is a dynast. It's not unknown for plutocracy to be smuggled into the sort of democratic shell, if you like, but democracy as a project being suborned to plutocracy and also to arguably dynasty, as your book shows, might there be a convergence between these 2? And secondly, even if dynasty is not entirely convergent with plutocracy, I think our normative discomfort, and I come back to the theoretical argument here, our normative discomfort with dynasty is grounded in what I would insist is a fundamentally worthy principle, which is the equal right of every citizen to have the opportunity to participate in politics on equal terms. Anything less is a deep denial of the principle of political equality, which can't simply be about the right to vote. But to the extent that dynastic politics closes off doors to citizens who may be passionately motivated or to public service, for public service, and might have the ability and the competence to do so, but do not possess that dynastic calling card, it definitely diminishes our democracy. So democracy may not be unique in India, but the specific form it takes may be one of the aspects of the ways in which democracy, a Western implant arguably, translates in different social contexts. That is an argument we are familiar with. But, and again return, Kanchan, you contested this argument, Mr. Khurshid advanced it again in another form. Might the cultural acceptance, and this is the 43 or 46% in the survey that Vaishnav and Kapoor did, of people who accept dynastic leadership, might the cultural acceptance for hereditary occupations as such, a predilection that arguably is built into the caste system, have something to do with this? And it seems to me that the predominance of Hindu upper caste males among the beneficiaries of dynastic politics in your data is a pointer to that. So I wouldn't dismiss out of hand the cultural acceptance by voters of this phenomenon. I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand, and especially because, I mean, the studies in the US have shown that politics is the one domain in which there is a predominance of dynasty, whereas in other occupations, dynasty is less prominent. It is more prominent in politics than it is. Okay, I'll stop here now, Patrick, and we can raise other questions.
That was tremendous, thank you. So you've got half a question there already, and I'm just going to follow it up with a kind of zinger from the side, which is, do you not think that even taking it outside the Indian or South Asian context, that maybe there is a predilection for dynasty, a predilection for aristocracy? If you go back to Jean Bodin 500 years ago talking about the idea of sovereignty, the idea of the state, it was intimately bound up with the idea of kingship, of monarchy, and particularly the idea of a hereditary aristocracy. And is it not possible that there is a kind of collective lie that we're living, that we want everything to be democratic, that we want a democratic state, but countless numbers of voters actually rather like the idea of some form of distant hereditary privilege? And you can see that outside India, you can see it in people called Bush and Clinton suddenly getting nominations. You can see it with the global obsession, I think possibly even the growing global obsession with the British royal family. So is it not possible that there is a kind of temperamental underpinning in favor of what is an aberration in democratic theory?
Shall I answer? So I'll take a quick stab at that. I think if that were the case, we should see stronger support among voters for dynastic politics. And I think conclusive work may be an individual level survey, but here are at least 4 reasons why I tend to discount that explanation. One is, if you look at constituencies, I mentioned this point in passing, it is very, very common for the same constituency to send a dynastic MP to parliament and then switch to a non-dynastic MP. So, if we had a case where you had constituencies being represented by dynastic MPs in a stable way, that would suggest that you have voters who have this kind of cultural acceptance of dynastic politics. But it is very common for dynastic candidates to be defeated by non-dynastic ones. A second is, if you look at winning margins, dynastic MPs win with slightly higher winning margins than the non-dynastic MPs, but it's tiny, it's 2%. Now, given how close elections are in India, 2% can make the difference between winning and losing in a number of constituencies. But you're not seeing this great gap between dynastic and non-dynastic people. The third, you want me to stop? So I'll stop. Maybe the third point, because Patrick is frowning at me. The third point is really what you see is dynasties encased within parties. Countries like Pakistan or the Philippines, it's very common that you have a dynastic candidate, say, being refused by a political party or leaving a political party, running as an independent and doing very well. The Philippines, families are really, parties are essentially, enveloped within families. In India, it's the opposite. In India, no dynastic, candidate in the 21st century has won as an independent. It's always dynasties who need the stamp of the political party. And what we find is when dynastic candidates leave the party, when they defect, or when they form a new party, they switch parties, they tend to do less well. And so we really think this is more of a party-driven than a voter-driven story.
So if it is party-driven, maybe I'll switch this question over to Jen Sinha. You made this interesting point about the difference between sort of heritage or legacy as against dynasty. I have to drop in as a footnote that I think 3 out of 4 of my fellow panelists say dynasty rather than dynasty, which I think shows the influence of American television on Indian culture. But anyway, we'll stick with dynasty. Do you think that in a way we need to break this down to look at particular parties rather than speaking generically about Indian political parties? We need to say, well, in some parties it is acceptable to be dynastic. In other parties, such as your own, the BJP, it's much more difficult. It's not impossible, but if you come from a dynastic background, that doesn't actually give you as big a leg up as it would in some other political parties.
No, I think that's right, Patrick. I think part of the challenge that we have in this discussion is because we have very different perspectives. I think Kanchan and Nirja are representing an academic perspective, which seems to be from the data down. I look at the data and I come to conclusions. I think Khurshid Saab and I and Shashiji, who's sitting here, would have a very different bottoms up from the voter perspective. And I think if you look from the bottoms up, from the voters' perspective and from the perspective of what's actually happening at the ground level, I think whether it's parties or candidates, you'd see a massively diverse set of phenomena that you can't generalize on, and like the way you'd love to do in an academic paper. And frankly, then that academic paper, I believe, ends up becoming fairly specious, because really the conclusions are not very sound, because they don't reflect the diversity that exists at the ground level. At a very minimum, when we talk about parties in India, we have to recognize that we have national parties, we have regional parties, we have parties that are quote-unquote dynastic, we have parties that are ideological, and all of these parties at the end of the day have to deal with the calculus of who's going to win an election. Now, how that works out for each individual party depends on the internal mechanics of the party, whether it's being driven on an ideological basis or whether it's being driven by kinship or whatever else. And until we understand that granular, nuanced sense of what is actually happening at the grassroots level in politics, I think any other conclusions or any other discourse that we will have will be quite off the mark.
That's an interesting point. Can I go over now to Mr. Khurshid? Do you agree that it's very much dependent on the individual party, or is it really to do with what's coming out at constituency level from potential voters? And one other thing I'd also like you to touch on, because of your long experience in politics, is the fact that one of the difficulties with research on this subject of dynastic democracy is that we don't have much data but before the year 2004. So is your impression that if you go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was a similar phenomenon, or is it accelerating and getting more dominant?
Well, 3 quick points. I think that the data will be there somewhere, and it can be brought out. You won't have a very different picture. There could be a little bit more, a little bit less. I can't imagine that the picture was very different, but things have happened in the last 25 years in this country, and that is the financing of politics has become very significant. The splits in various parties have indicated to their leaders that unless you control funding of parties, you can't control the party. And this is sort of obviously followed by people at different level. So the money that goes into politics, which is hugely unaccounted, is controlled by someone. And that someone who controls the money is someone who has to become the old or the new or the future dynasty, because money is what keeps the dynasty alive. Otherwise you become like a pauper prince that nobody comes and visits you, but you just have a history that would be interesting to Patrick French because he wants to write a book, but nothing beyond that. Keep in mind one interesting thing. We brought a revolutionary change in this country when we introduced reservations in different levels of the electoral process for women. And the remarkable new vocabulary emerged out of that is when the first generation of people were elected, there was a new expression that was used in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh of people who were called Pradhan Patis, the husband of the elected chief of the village. And the guards that were given to the woman would be guards who accompanied the man all over the place while she remained happily at home, and the husband would go and get things signed. But let me just say that third generation, fourth generation, there are women who are coming out into their own, and the profile is beginning to change. But even now, the fact that some constituency is reserved, you first look at whose wife, whose daughter, and whose sister can stand in the elections there. And I think that validates my thesis that we haven't yet broken away from feudalism.
Thank you. So before we just open out questions to you in the audience, I have one more question for Professor Jayal, which is following on really from, if you like, could one say the culturalist explanations that you're suggesting for this phenomenon. Do you think there's a problem in political theory or in theories of democracy in that it does not account for this question of dynasty, which seems to be so significant not only in India but in many other countries as well?
Well, political theory accounts for it and doesn't account for it in a certain sense. I mean, in political theory, the idea of democracy is associated with political equality and accountability. And so dynasty can lead you to a situation where these are denied. So it's a denial of the basic principles of democratic theory, and it's in denial that dynasty appears. But political science, as opposed to political theory, does deal with it. I mean, Mr. Sinha may find some of this specious, but that's the trade, and that's what we do. And that's, in a sense, what this book has done, which is to pull together data, not just based on the ground level, deep personal experience of, let's say, 3 members of parliament right here, but based upon a larger data set, large numbers of people being interviewed and data being gathered on them. So political science does deal with it, but it gives us the empirics of the story. In the case of India, there's absolutely nothing. This is the first book. Your chapter was, I think, the first, it was, as Kanchan said, the point of departure for her work, which I did not know, but that's the only thing I've read on the subject before this book, so yeah. So political theory and political science, I would make a distinction. I would say one gives us the empirics of this, and the other actually tells us in what ways dynasty constitutes a denial of political equality and, to some extent, accountability.
No, but let me just intercede on this because we're having a discussion, I think, which is in some ways a meta discussion as well, which is when we interpret and try and understand the issue of dynasties and democracies. What is the purpose of that dialogue in the first instance? And yes, there can be people from different perspectives that come to that dialogue, as we have on this panel, from an academic perspective, from a practitioner's perspective. So we come from different perspectives, which is why the conversation is interesting. But at the end of the day, there has to be a purpose to the conversation. And I think you're exactly right to bring up this notion of, is the democracy functioning well? And the democracy is functioning well if the nation is advancing, if democratic will is expressed, and if we feel that nobody is being denied their due. And I think in that regard, whether you look at it from an academic perspective or a practitioner's perspective, I've got to believe, which is what I said right at the outset, that there is in fact a vast churning happening in India's democracy, and this is where I'm contesting what Khurshid Saab is saying. I'm saying that this notion of India still being feudal and feudalism being rampant, I'm not saying that's what's in the book right now, but I think that's what we have to discuss, because that feudalism then deprives people of their rights, which we all agree is the purpose of this discussion. I actually don't think that's the case. And whether you come at it from an academic perspective or a practitioner's perspective, this denial of democracy's privileges and democracy's benefits to the people, I don't think is happening in India. As I said, we saw that in the Rajya Sabha, we've seen that in election after election. So I think, in fact, democracy is taking India forward, and it's a good news story, not necessarily a bad news story.
So in fact, in India, despite having democratic dynasties, democracy is perhaps still functioning certainly better than electoral politics in some other countries. And of course, voter participation in India tends to be higher than in, pretty much any democracy you care to look at. So what we'll do now is take some, yes, just very briefly. Yeah.
So, voter participation is absolutely fantastic, and it is a well-functioning democracy by every indicator of that kind. We are here talking about entry barriers for people who wish to enter politics and compete in politics, but do not have that dynastic calling card. It's really about that.
Okay, so if people in the audience would now like to speak, if you have a sort of a longer statement, then please save it for the cocktail party afterwards. But if you'd like to make a brief intervention, then please do. Yeah.
Imported the feudal system into Indian politics. But that necessarily would imply that the public that we're talking of that chooses this particular political class is lacking in choice. But that doesn't seem to be the sentiment in the manner in which these dynastic leaders end up getting support from the people. So what is your opinion on that? Is it really feudal in that sense, or is it more that we're choosing somebody because we associate them with a particular brand of values that come with family?
And then there's somebody question. Yes, there. Yeah, I'm pointing right at you. Yeah, you. You ask a question, and then there's somebody about 8 rows back in the middle.
Okay, so just a question on, who the people, what the notion of the people about a Kabil leader, so to say, is. Now, even in a dynasty, for example, if the father wanted to just nominate his eldest son by some rule, that may or may not be something that the voters like. So they may favor son number 3, son number 4. So there's a sense in which there is a choice of the voter operating in here. And for example, if you take the specific instance of Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav, his wife was rejected by the people as a leader. The daughter definitely has had to send to the upper house, and not the eldest son, but the other one is considered a Kabil leader. So is there some amount of voter demand driving of what the notion of an effective leader can be?
Thank
I
you.
wanted to know that how would you contextualize this practice of the erstwhile royal families continuing to retain those titles of Maharaja, Maharani, Rajmata in this context of dynastic politics?
Okay, so we've got a range of questions there, everything from feudalism to choice of different family members, the idea of social identity and markers, and then, of course, the royal aspect and how that incorporates. Sir, do you want to answer?
Thank you. I will pick 2 questions. The first one, clearly, it's they're both linked. It's not that if you have dynasties, it doesn't mean that democracy is not functioning. These are, it is a functioning democracy, but these are factors of our democracy that we have to accept. Nobody seems to have, in the last 2 months, talked about Hillary Clinton being part of a dynasty. Nobody, absolutely nobody. How would Hillary Clinton have become what she has if she wasn't associated with President Clinton? It's a big question. Perhaps it's not an asset, perhaps it's just coincidental. But I think we need to look at it a little further. And if she gets elected as President of the United States, as I hope she does, we are not going to debunk democracy in the United States. Frankly, if her opponent got elected, we might be very worried. But the other point is, dynasties in India are validated by the voter. No, these are not dictatorial dynasties. These are voter-preferred dynasties. And that is the interesting conundrum about Indian politics, is that people prefer dynasties. And I said, workers insist that dynasties must be retained. That's the manner in which democracy functions. Now, people are challenging this. There is a major thrust in recent times which is just blindly anti-dynastic. But quite interestingly, often anti-dynastic movements seek members of the same dynasty to come and oppose that dynasty. And that's happened between the Congress and the BJP. I mean, if you know who I'm talking about. But the point remains that there are new faces also emerging. The Aam Aadmi Party emerged. But if you analyze very carefully where the MPs and MLAs have come from, you would know that there are dynasties in the making even there, even if the top man doesn't have a dynasty, not yet at least.
Kanchan Chandra, if I could just make one point though, is, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the Aam Aadmi Party is the only party to have said that if you have a family member who's been elected, then that's it for that family. No one else is allowed to stand.
Yeah, but that's the third interesting word in Indian politics is hypocrisy. So you do have to see hypocrisy.
So there were many questions. I'll just address this point about voters and the demand, and I hope that'll touch on some of the questions. You know, Mr. Sinha made this point about how if you contrast an academic with a practitioner's perspective, some of the data might seem specious. And I do want to say, you know, there are many forms of knowledge, and academic knowledge is certainly not the only one. And also when it comes to the data do not speak for themselves, and there's a great deal more to be said with the data. So I do want to support that point in the sense, I don't think this book is the last word or the arguments we make here are the last word. We really think of them as more of a first word. But now I do want to move away from the data and maybe talk about some examples where I don't think when it comes to parties it is winnability that is the only driving criterion. It is one of several. Let me give you two examples, one from the Congress and the BJP, and then I'll stop. The Congress party in its Jaipur declaration actually said quite explicitly, winnability is not the only criterion by which we should allocate tickets, and I quote verbatim, there's a balance is required between winnability and loyalty. And the Congress party has often declared that it is not going to give tickets to people who have lost or, you know, where the winning margin has been high, but frequently does that in practice. Now the BJP, I haven't found an explicit sort of statement to this effect, but there are plenty of examples. I'll give you one example and I'll stop. Poonam Mahajan in the 2011 elections, the assembly elections in Maharashtra, lost by a margin of about 26,000 votes. But she was she was nominated as a parliamentary candidate and then won. And there is something going on here where the stamp of the party, the endorsement of the party can often improve the winning prospects of an MP. And I do want to highlight that comes from reading party literature, it comes from talking to practitioners. It's just not a matter of number crunching.
Okay, I'll ask more.
You know, what I will just say is there was a question about, काबिल नेता कौन है और अगर मतदाता किसी को चुन रहे हैं तो किस कारण चुन रहे हैं. And I think there, at least my own limited experience has been that voters are very rational. They're very clear about why they are casting a vote, and at least the empirical work I've done seems to suggest that it's a third. 1/3 is who is the chief ministerial or prime ministerial candidate. That does make a big difference. A second factor that comes into play is what's the ideology of the party itself, and that's where the party association is very important. And then the third, who is the candidate. All of these three factors are things that voters very rationally think about when they in fact go to the polls, and if they prefer certain candidates, whether they're dynastic candidates or however you want to describe them, it's because they feel that that person is going to do the job for them. And I think that, again, as I was saying earlier, that is essentially an inherently a meritocratic process. And if you find that that candidate isn't delivering the goods for you in this election, then the next time around you will actually make sure that they are not the winning candidate, or at least in terms of getting your vote. So in that sense, we are finding that the democratic process is actually working quite well. People are electing candidates that they believe in, and therefore Indian democracy is maturing well. I think it's progressing well, and whatever we see of dynastic candidates or whatever is in some ways not very different from what you would expect to see in other even sophisticated advanced democracies.
Thank you very much. Let's take another round of questions from the audience. We've got a question here and a question here.
Bengal from the Trinamool. And I'd just like to sort of disagree with what Mr. Sinha just said, quite strongly, if I may, where he says that there are three things. He says that voters make rational decisions. I think, yes, we're a democracy in that we have a 90% turnout. Yes, we are a democracy. Everyone exercises their franchise. So yes, we're a functioning democracy. But when you say that you've got options and you're making, the voter has only got a limited set of options. In India, people are voting for a party first and a candidate second. So when he said that there are three things, the first is the chief ministerial or the prime ministerial candidate, the second is the party, the third is the candidate. So for example, I'll just use Bengal as an example. If you've got Mamata Banerjee as a chief ministerial candidate, people want her, they vote for the Trinamool. Number two, they like what the work Trinamool is doing at the rural level, they vote for the Trinamool. Number two boxes are ticked. So the third box becomes almost irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Whoever the person stands on a party ticket will win. So it is up to the party and its internal meritocracy or democracy to actually make sure that someone who gets nominated is not a dynast versus a dynast. So when you say when people are removed, when dynasts have been removed by non-dynasts, it is when a party has been voted out. In 2004, 2009 and 2014. 2004, Sachin Pilot, Jyotiraditya Scindia, Jitin Prasad and somebody else were voted in. 2009, the Congress came back, all of them were voted in. In 2014, three of them lost. Milind Deora lost, Sachin Pilot lost, not because they were any less the sons of their fathers, but because as a party the Congress was rejected. So that's where I think it's important, and I think that, it's not a...
Thank you very much.
What about leftist parties? Do they have they have these dynasties? And do you think the inner party democracy, inner party, can make a difference? That's very important. And I think Mr. Khurshid has made a very kind of an elitist argument by saying people love dynasties. They don't love dynasties because they're at a lower level of consciousness. They're illiterate, they are poor, so they're not able to assert themselves. So it's not that people love dynasties because they have no other choice and they have internalized discrimination. And when Mr. Sinha says, look, the voters make rational choice, well, Indians vote in terms of caste, in terms of religion, there's so much of casteism and communalism. Do people make a rational choice when they vote in terms of caste and religion?
Thank you very much.
You said that in your book you want to come up with an institutionalist way of establishing a relationship between democracies and dynasties, and you believe that the causes of dynasty politics can be mainly found in two institutions. One is returns associated with state offices, another is parties, political. You talk about organizational weakness, which I think Professor Chhibbar has also talked about. And you also say that you're not very happy with the cultural essentialist argument, which bases this very idea of dynasty politics in the idea that it is based in the cultural values. My question is that it's a very good argument that you talk about returns associated with state politics and party politics, but I think cultural values play a very prominent role. Not only to talk about today's, use Max Weber's idea of charismatic leadership or that, but also if you look at ground level, if you go to the field, like you also mentioned correctly, you went to the field, we have used extensive data. I think cultural values, as somebody rightly, friendship ties and all those matter a lot. Because, for example, just one mention. If you look at, you have a chapter in about Professor Rudolphs, they talk about royal dynasties. So when you talk about royal dynasties, for example, we had Diya Kumari this time. She stood for the first time for elections and defeated a very powerful candidate, Meena candidate, who was very powerful. Yeah, so that's my question.
Okay, thanks. And I'm actually going to allow one bonus question to Shashi Tharoor in the front row on the grounds that we need to have a...
I want to know what is the importance of culture.
Just a brief observation and a question mainly for the academics on the panel. The brief observation is I think there's no doubt that dynasty is an advantage when it comes to getting a party ticket. And that's ultimately where the option presented to the voter comes. Yes, the dynast still has to win an election, but the dynast may never have a chance to win an election if he weren't a dynast. And that, I think, is largely demonstrated through the selection of, especially otherwise, young and relatively less qualified candidates. But the question to the academics who've been looking at the data and crunching it and so on is, do you see dynasty, can you see dynasty, as I sometimes suspect, as a very interesting way of actually bringing a different kind of person into Indian politics? Because the dynast, the sons of the old-time politicians, have gone off and had a very different education from their fathers. They've studied in elite institutions, many have gone abroad, some have worked abroad. And they've come back in with a kind of CV that would have never got them a party ticket in the old days, but they get the party ticket because they're Dinesh. And therefore, you're getting into Parliament a bunch of people who sort of come from Wharton and private equity firms and all sorts of interesting backgrounds who you'd never have seen in Parliament. Are we seeing a change in the sociological composition of Parliament because of dynasty? And that may be an unusual way of looking at this phenomenon.
Okay, we've got a real range of questions there. I think I'm going to start at this end of the panel. So we've got intra-party democracy, we've got voter options, we've got rational choice theory, we've got the suggestion from Shashi Tharoor that the plethora of foreign returned people being brought into Parliament may itself result in some degree of social change on the floor of the House.
Right.
Let's go.
So I think the discussion has moved. So I'm glad some of the questions, the last couple of questions, have pulled it back into the topic of the book, as it were, because I think we moved quite far away from voter perceptions and why voters vote for dynasts or non-dynasts and so on, which is not really the subject of this book. And Kanchan only cited one small survey on the subject. So I think that question is why people vote for who they vote is not part of what this is about. The question of who comes into politics as a result of dynasty and the dynastic method of giving tickets, or the dynastic basis of giving tickets in parties, is precisely the question, Kanchan, that I asked you earlier, which is that this is a probably statistically insignificant number of people that Mr. Tharoor just mentioned, statistically insignificant, but in terms of visibility, extremely significant, right? In terms of the leadership positions they occupy, extremely significant. How do we make sense of this? Because your explanation, the party part of the explanation works, which is that the weak organizational structures of parties and their methods of making decisions about ticket allotment and so on. But the first part of the explanation, which is the inducements of state power, especially discretionary state power, and you emphasize post-liberalization in your book, how does that work? Because these people don't need that. And these people are obviously there for it. So do we need a different kind of explanation for two different types of dynasts coming into politics in the post-feudal, technically post-feudal period? Right.
Thank you, Professor Jayal. Mr. Sinha.
I would say that there are, again, as I was saying, from the ground level up, a diverse set of models operating in Indian politics right now. I would say that there are certain party models that are meritocratic, that are ideological, where ticket selection is not necessarily, as Shashiji is asserting, because of privileges, but really because they are candidates that can do the job and be able to deliver the results that voters are expecting. So I think we have a wide range of models out there, and that's what makes the study of this, whether it's from the data down or from the bottom up, so interesting. But that's what I'm saying, given the wide diversity and so on, it's difficult to come up with sweeping generalizations about it. It all depends on a variety of models, which party are we talking about, and so on. And I think that's what makes it fascinating, and I think that's what also makes it a fast evolving and almost a Darwinian process of improvement as well, where the better models will come forward.
Thank you. Mr. Khurshid.
I'll just point to your question. That word love I haven't used all evening. I don't know where you got it. People love dynasties, I never said. I said dynasties are not dictatorial. They are validated and voted in by people. Whether people vote that for one reason or another, I'm not discussing today. But love is not a word I used. And therefore, don't be misled into what the purpose, what the base of a dynasty is. The fact is that dynasties do get elected. That's a fact. Can't run away from that. And the fact is that political managers believe that dynasties work, and therefore they seek out dynasties. It's a fortunate thing that dynasties haven't kept their people in their younger generations in dark holes and brought them out at election time, but they've actually sent them to Wharton and Howard and Yale and Cambridge, etc., which is a good thing. But somebody who's been to Wharton, Yale and Cambridge on their own and whose parents are not in politics, how difficult it is for them to get into politics, somebody could answer that question. Somebody sitting here who could answer that question, how difficult it is. But But the good thing is that there are people whose parents have not been in politics, who've been exceptionally successful, and they are few and far between. I hope there are going to be many more in times to come. There are two kinds of people who are searching for a role in Indian politics. These people who are independent, professionals, well-educated, who are moving in. There are professional, educated people from dynasties who are coming in. And there are people who are just saying, we want to challenge the entire establishment. And therefore, they get a hearing as well. Now, are they going to be able to change the landscape, or are they, as I said, hypocrites, that they just are there to start new dynasties, etc.? Too early to say. So we just leave the judgment to be pronounced in 2019, then 2025, and then 2030. You'll be around, we'll be around, so we'll have another discussion.
So thank you. And Kanchan Chandra will now give a sort of unified answer. I've got one more question that I want to throw to you, which I thought would come up but hasn't. And that is the idea of representative democracy, and that democracy is different from, for example, saying that a family tends to produce doctors or tends to produce lawyers. And that unless there is wider representation, you create a very profound feeling of social exclusion. And that maybe the risk of too much democratic dynasty is rather like the risk of having, for example, a police force which does not in any way reflect the different minority communities that make up a particular state or a particular city. So does democracy have to be representative in order to function better than it does at the moment?
So thanks, Patrick. I think I'll try and take a stab at that question, and also the question the young woman asked about culture, I think, as a way of linking these two. So, I don't think that, it's not that culture is not important in understanding dynastic politics. I just don't think we can think of cultural attitudes as a cause. But there is a very interesting interactive relationship between culture and dynastic politics, in which culture shapes the form that dynastic politics takes, and then dynastic politics changes culture right back. So I'll give you an example. I think one way in which culture affects dynastic politics in India is this preponderance of men among dynasties. So most of the dynasties in our data are father-son. There are very, very few women who are founders of dynasties, but essentially it's predominantly male. But now you see, the book focuses on parliament, but if you look at the panchayat elections, it's a very common phenomenon where you have sort of women essentially stand up as proxies for their husbands. And earlier this year, I was in Jharkhand for the panchayat elections, where in fact there was a constituency where, the woman was the candidate, but in addition to her face on the banner, you also had the face of her husband. That's very common. But then not just the husband, also the father-in-law. So you look at that and you say, this is a way in which culture is shaping dynastic politics. It's pushing you towards male dynasties. But then in the same election, there was another banner where the seat had switched from being reserved for women to now being an open seat for men. And so there was a male candidate who stood, but because his wife was better known, he couldn't be sure about his own chances. And so that banner said, so-and-so, husband of. And you had the prominent picture there of women, So I think that's an example of how culture can shift through dynastic politics. But it's not, I think, a simple cause-effect relationship. And just it gets back to this question about representation and new entrants. And as Nijar said, I think you're right, this question about inclusion is clearest when it comes to women. But there, what dynastic politics is doing is, it is bringing in new entrants. It is bringing in entrants who are representative in some interesting ways, and it is changing the dynamics within the family, or what we think of also as a family. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. So thanks to the panelists, Nirja Gopal Jayal, Jayant Sinha, Salman Khurshid and Kanchan Chandra. Thank you all very much for coming. And on behalf of your team of hosts, Cambridge University Press, Seminar Magazine, Logniti CSDS, and Bikaner House, please now enjoy the cocktails, but most of all, buy the book. Thank you very much.